So we define HTML input field and a HTML label. So this is one of the advantage of React because it actually create a JavaScript objects under hood and then send that to the browser to manipulate the DOM. So this function is actually a JavaScript uh, under hood, but it just have the HTML inside the JavaScript. For input field and label combination, we specified three HTML attributes: HTML4, ID, and type. So additionally, in traditional JavaScript without React, we actually use script. So that script, the reason for that is the only way for us to communicate with HTML is using that script tag. So essentially, we're actually changing the DOM or the structure of the browser, and then we change that with respect to the DOM or the HTML. Now, here with React, we're basically not doing that anymore because those are complicated. These provide us like a declarative way instead of imperative way of doing programming. So here, as you can see, we still have the three HTML attributes: HTML4, ID, and type. The type attribute is kinda mandatory and has nothing to do with focusing the input field when clicking the label. So that this type attribute of HTML, which is text, is mandatory. It has nothing to do with the search or focusing the input field when searching. So however, while ID and type should be familiar from native HTML, HTML4 might be new to you. The HTML4 reflects the 4 attribute in vanilla HTML. You may be wondering why this attribute differs from native HTML. JSX replaces a handful of internal HTML attributes caused by internal implementation details of React itself. So, because React needs a way for it to use like a JavaScript and HTML, it needs to do this by replacing like a handful of the internal HTML attributes into this naming. However, you can find all the supported HTML attributes in React's documentation. Since JSX is closer to JavaScript than to HTML, so again, it's closer to JavaScript because in the end, it just used like a JavaScript to manipulate HTML. That's why I said those function are just JavaScript under hood. React uses the camel case naming for convention. So because of that, React uses the camel case, which is what JavaScript uses. Expect to come across more JSX specific features like class name and on click instead of class and on click. So instead of class in HTML, we have class name, and then instead of on click small letter, we have on with a capital letter C. On click capital letter C, as you will learn more about React. So when using HTML in JSX, React internally translates all HTML attributes to JavaScript, where certain words such as class or for are reserved during rendering processes. Therefore, React came up with replacements such as class name and HTML4 for them. However, once the actual HTML is rendered for the browser, the attributes get translated back to their native variant. So we will discuss this further, how React internally translate all HTML attributes to a JavaScript. So the class again and the on click are reserved for during the rendering process, but still get translated to a real HTML attributes. So React is just a wrapper. So here we have HTML this converted to JavaScript HTML4, but then in the browser it went back to the actual HTML. We will revisit the HTML input field and its label for further implementation details with JavaScript later. For now, in order to contrast how HTML and JavaScript are used in JSX, let's use more complex JavaScript data types in JSX. So now to be able to understand it better, we will discuss complex data type. So how the JavaScript and HTML is different is this um, complex data type. So instead of defining a script, JavaScript string primitive like title, define a JavaScript object called welcome, which is a title, react, and greeting hey as properties. Afterward, we will try to render both properties of the object in JSX side by side in the h1 tag before we have defined a JavaScript string primitive to be displayed in the app component. Now the same can be done with the JavaScript object by accessing its properties with JSX. So here, we created an object instead of just a simple primitive data type. So again, a primitive data type, as we discussed in the previous videos, are those constants. Well, an object data type is just sorry, it's not constant. It changes dynamically because they have like enumerable, writable, and configurable properties. Additionally, when we're defining an object, so everything in JavaScript is a variable. Okay, um, some variable are just constants, so those are the primitive data types. But this object is still a variable. So the reason why it's important is because later we will discuss how the variable is really the one thing that operates all of the JavaScript, because that's how you um, contain the primitive types, and that's how you contain the object types. So everything in a JavaScript is a function. So the way you contain those functions to be able to use to be able to create your application is basically variable. So to connect that in real life in businesses, they usually have those functions that allows them to benefit their customers. So in essence, like to be able to mimic that in a software, we're using variables to execute or to be able to use those functions. Now here we have welcome.greeting. So we use this object that their properties inside the h1. So while HTML can be used almost except for So while HTML can be used almost except for the attributes in its native way in JSX, So we can use HTML in its native way, just like as we can see here, except for the attributes. Because remember, HTML has an attributes as well. So some of that are actually needs to work with React, such as the class name and the onClick. Everything in curly braces can be used to interpolate JavaScript in it. So that's essentially how you mix the HTML and JavaScript. You can use everything HTML except for the attribute, exceptions for the attributes. And then you can use a JavaScript interpolation or these curly braces here. So you can use that to insert JavaScript value inside an HTML. So for example, you can define a function that returns the title and execute it within curly braces. So here we define a function and then we execute that inside an HTML curly braces. So it's, as you can see, it's an easier way to program things because you define an object in the JavaScript and then show that uh, in the HTML itself. Unlike with before, you have to like be dependent on script tag of HTML or from the functionality that might come from other file. And because the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript programming before is inherently imperative programming, it is harder to like manipulate the DOM. But essentially, we're just manipulating the DOM node object in the browser. Now, as you can see, this is the essence of React. This is how you change the browser structure using your using your a program, or this is how you create a software essentially using this simple code or module function or function inside the module along with HTML. So now you can see how we actually change code using this programming language. So here, JSX is a syntax to JavaScript. In the past, JavaScript files which made use of JSX had to use the .jsx instead of the JS extension. However, these days, several build tools like compiler or bundler can be configured to acknowledge JSX in a JS file. So there's like Webpack, transpiler like Babel, especially for React, that can use to be able to read those JSX files like this in a JS file. So let's say you have a file, you created a file in VS Code that ends in .js, but it has this kind of writings. It will understand that if you have those transpilers such as Webpack and Babel. If they are configured in this way, they will transpile JSX to JavaScript. So if you have those configured in that way, they will convert this into just JavaScript because again, JSX is closer to JavaScript than HTML. Tools like Vite embrace the .jsx extension though because it makes it explicit for developers. For Vite, you can't actually use like that.js for like for simplicity to the developers. So you need to actually write .jsx. So here we have const title equal React. So this is the JSX element, const my element, and then it will transpile to JavaScript. This we will dig deep on how it actually convert that into JavaScript under the hood using this const my element react.create element. So essentially this is what React JavaScript code is. React.create element h1 comma null hello title, and then it gets rendered as HTML by React. how do JavaScript objects, React elements, actually become real DOM nodes? Who talks to the browser? React, V8, JavaScript. Let's answer this cleanly and connect everything you asked. Your core question rephrased clearly. You're asking, how does this type input, comma, props ID search turn into this input ID equals to search? So essentially, this is HTML. So who actually does it? So how does this create element JavaScript code of React are turned into this HTML? Or how do we actually combine JavaScript to HTML? The direct answer, React, which is the JavaScript code, calls browser DOM APIs like document that create element. So that's actually what is responsible for what have been mentioned uh, that combine JavaScript to a JSX or some or that allow us to use the HTML, all of the HTML features inside the JavaScript with the exception of attributes. It's the React code under hood that talks to DOM APIs. So to create real DOM nodes, the missing link, this is what you're looking for. React does something like this internally. Simplified version of what React does, const el equal document that create element with the parameter string input semicolon, then next line l.id equal parameters search. That's it. So your statement is correct. This object talks to browser DOM API. So internally, this is what React does. Document that create element, which is this connection to a DOM API, and then it put an input. So it is a JavaScript contacting the DOM API of the browser for it to create this node input. That's why you see input in the browser. Now el.id is equals to search. So this is how you map the search node of the browser using JavaScript of React to that input. So that's it. So your statement is correct. This object talks to browser DOM API. Yes, but indirectly, React reads the object. React calls DOM API. DOM node is created. So this JavaScript with JSX or HTML are actually being read by React. So think about this like what we have discussed with Node.js. Sorry, with the V8 engine. So normally you would talk a process from process to directly to an OS if it's a desktop application. But for browser, the event loop handles first, so it sits on top of that process. So before you can talk directly to an OS feature, you need to talk to a V8 engine. It's the same with React. You can write a JavaScript in JSX, but that sits on top of React. React, whatever way it does things, will still have to locally do it in itself to transform your code based on its rules. So think about React as a system that you must comply, kind of like in basketball, the rules where there's traveling. So those are the system that you need to comply. So React are just providing that to you. Now to be able to like communicate with a browser is that you need to comply with the React code. So that's one way to look at it. So This object talks to browser, and yes, but indirectly, React creates the object, React calls DOM API, DOM node is created. Full breakdown of that step, the real under the hood. Step A, you wrote JSX like input, ID parameter string, closing tag. Step B, it becomes an object with heap, type input, then props, ID search. Step C, React processes it. React literally does if type is equal input, then inside const DOM node is equal document that create element with the parameter string input, semicolon, the next line DOM node that ID is equals to search. So as you can see, this is a JavaScript code that was based from this object. So as you can see, we write a code, it becomes a heap like this. So this heap, we will discuss this in great detail in the next video. And then React processes it using just a JavaScript code. And just like with any software, under hood, it's just like this, an if else, while, etc. Key inside, React is equal a layer that translates objects to DOM API calls. So again, it transformed that heaps to a JavaScript API calls to the DOM to manipulate the DOM. So where V8 fits here, V8 is a JavaScript engine. It handles executing React code, storing objects, heap, running functions, stock. So this is the runtime engine where it has the stock, heap, and code. So what it is executing, so think about this with the OS3 PC pieces. So the code is the actual React. Once it compiled, it becomes an object and then a JavaScript under hood. So the object, the one that we saw, is the structure, and then the stock is the actual JavaScript code that has this this if type. So this is an if else, type equal is the stock, and then inside is another heap again. So that's what V8 JavaScript engine does here. But V8 does not create DOM. Instead, browser exposes DOM APIs to JavaScript. So again, V8 just run JavaScript, but browser are the one exposing DOM APIs, or like actually creating DOM node to the React. So who owns what? Layer V8 responsibility. Trans.js manages memory. So actual JS, and it manages the memory of V8 specifically, the code, the heap, and the stock. React, it translates objects to DOM operation. So again, the heap, the type with the props. So it becomes HTML, JavaScript with HTML becomes an object, a heap, and then it gets transpiled to a JavaScript contacting a DOM API. So browser responsibility, it owns the DOM. The OS responsibility, it handles the input, the mouse input. Now your question about document that get element by ID. This document that get element by ID, parameter string search, means ask browser, give me the DOM node with this ID. So this document that get element by ID that was translated from React heap to a JavaScript, basically contacting or asking the browser, DOM, give me the DOM with this ID. And browser already have that for us. Now it returns reference to DOM node. Very important, this is not JSX, this is not React, this is direct DOM API. So it has nothing to do with JSX React. It's just a DOM API that has been used by developers before. Now declarative React versus imperative DOM API. React declarative, which is input ID equals to search. You describe what should exist. Now DOM MPI imperative, const L equal document that create element parameter input. Now L.id equal parameter search thing, and then document.body.append child parameter L semicolon. You manually control how to build it. So before, this is the imperative way, which is more complicated. Now connection, React writes the imperative code for you. Your question? Focus, like this, input.focus is a DOM method browser API. It has nothing to do with JSX. So React converted to JS, which is the JS code, contacting DOM API, then the browser executes focus. And yes, input is equal reference pointer to DOM node. Now, your big flow question, correcting precisely, you asked, does React build element 3 first, then call DOM API? Correct order. JSX converted to objects, which is heaps, then React builds element 3 in JS memory. And then React divs 3 virtual DOM concept. So first it creates a heap, and then it converts to JavaScript. So that JavaScript will now create the element 3 in JS memory, because again, JavaScript are being executed in what? In JS memory, which is the V8 engine. And then React divs 3 virtual DOM concept, the one that's checking those browser DOM, before it actually communicate that to DOM, it actually check if that is cached already. Now fourth, React calls DOM API. So as you can see, it builds or it runs in itself in its JS memory, and then check first the difference in virtual DOM concept. Now React calls DOM API. Create element, append child, set attribute, then browser updates UI. Important correction, React does not create DOM first. It decides what to create and then calls DOM API. 11. Now how browser talk to OS? When focus happens, browser does this. First, mark element as active. Second, update UI cursor. And then third, notify OS. So keyboard input goes here. So that browser changed the element as active, update the UI that you see on your LCD, and then it will notify the OS that hey, the input when clicking goes here. When you click this, that's how you map the virtual DOM and the mouse of your computer. So OS does routes keyboard input to browser to input field. So the OS routes the keyboard input now to the browser into the actual input field, because we map it already. Now connect to JSX chapter, your confusion, curly braces like H1, curly braces title, closing H1. What happens? First, the app function runs the stack, and then second, it reads the title, which is in the heap, and then third, it builds string. So after you reads the title, it will build the string, because inside that object is a string, and then fourth, it is inserted into React element. So that's what happened under hood. So we have stack and heap before we build the actual string and insert that again to a React element, which is a heap as well. So attributes and then remember those object follows the diffing tree. That's the only difference. So before you contact those DOM API, all are still objects, but before you contact that, you need to check if it's cached already. Now attributes, HTML4, class name. So class HTML4 equals to search. React converts HTML4 to 4, then class name to actual class HTML attribute. So when calling DOM API, we have labeled that set attribute um, parameter string for comma search string. So your final question is this what you're asking? Yes, you were circling around this document that create element function, append child function, and event listener. This is the truth. React is equal abstraction over this exact API. So everything you've been asking reduces to how does React replace manual DOM manipulation? Answer: it converts JSX to objects that hits and then converts to JavaScript and then check via virtual diffing and then call DOM APIs for you. So final mental model, clean plus and complete. JSX to JS objects V8 heap. Then React interprets objects via um, JavaScript. So it's currently running already. Now before that, it checks it via diffing algorithm. Then calls DOM API, create element, append child, etc. Then browser creates DOM nodes. Then user interacts on that node, and then JS calls DOM methods like focus, etc. Then browser updates UI. Then OS handles real input and output. So why is this hard? And you're doing it right. You're trying to understand code to memory, to runtime, to browser, to OS.